Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a fascinating paper that asks a huge question. What's the philosophical glue? The stuff that holds a republic together. And maybe even more important, what happens when that glue starts to dissolve? So let's dive right in.
So, this is a question that thinkers have wrestled with for, centuries. What exactly holds a republic together? Is it just the laws on the books? Is it a constitution? Maybe it's a shared culture. Or is the essential ingredient something deeper?
Now, the source we're examining today offers a distinctly philosophical answer. It basically argues that a healthy republic depends on a shared, totally unified understanding of reality itself. The big three. What is real? How do we know what's real? And based on that, how should we act?
And this gets to the paper's central claim. It says Western society is suffering from something it calls metaphysical dissection. The argument goes like this. Those three big ideas, being, knowing, and acting, they were once seen as completely interconnected, like a single fabric. But over time, they've been intellectually and, the paper says, intentionally severed, cut apart. And that's what's leading to societal instability.
Okay, so how did this happen? How did this dissection actually take place? Well, the paper points to three really key intellectual moments. It calls them cuts, that it says severed the original foundations of the American Republic.
Right, so, according to this source, this wasn't just one big event. It was a process, something that unfolded over more than a century. As you can see, the paper points to three key thinkers, each making a distinct cut. We're going to examine them in the order they actually happened. And the first one, it starts way back, right around the American founding. Okay, so let's look at that first cut. This one, happening way back around the founding, targeted the very nature of law. The paper argues that this is the moment where law starts to get disconnected from any kind of higher moral or, metaphysical reality.
And the person that paper identifies here is founding father James Wilson. Now, he was influenced by the big legal thinkers of his time, and he championed this view that human reason, and specifically the reason of judges and legal elites, is the ultimate source of a law's authority, not something higher.
And this really gets to the heart of that shift. According to the paper, law used to be seen as a reflection, a mirror of some fixed, transcendent moral truth. But after this cut, it becomes a creation of elite human intellect, something that's defined and structured by judges.
All right, let's move on to the second cut. This is the one the paper says severed knowledge from reality. And this involves a really fundamental shift in what philosophy was even for, back in the mid-1800s.
So the paper points us to a Scottish philosopher, James Ferrier. And his big idea was that philosophy's purpose wasn't to understand what is, what's actually out there in the world. Instead, he argued, philosophy should study the conditions of our own knowing. The whole focus just turned inward.
And here you can really see that severance in action. Before this, the whole point of knowing was to understand being, to make sure your thoughts lined up with what was actually real. But afterwards, the paper claims, knowledge becomes this self-contained system. It's judged on its own internal logic, and that crucial link to an external reality, it's broken.
And according to the source, that first cut we talked about, the one in law, it had a huge consequence. It basically set the stage for what the paper calls judicial supremacy. The idea is that once law was untethered from those fixed moral assumptions that existed at the founding, the judiciary was free to not just interpret the law, but to pretty much author it. Okay, on to the third and final cut discussed in the paper. This one was championed by the American pragmatists in the early 1900s, and it severed the very idea of truth from any kind of fixed reality.
So you have philosopher John Dewey and the pragmatists, and they make a pretty radical proposal. They argue that truth isn't about whether a statement matches reality. Nope. For them, truth is simply what works. Its value is all about its practical outcome, its cash value, as they would say.
And this, according to the paper, had a huge impact, especially in education. The goal of school wasn't about forming students in objective truths anymore. It became about conditioning them in flexibility, in being experimental. The process itself became way more important than any fixed principle.
But what's really interesting here is that the paper doesn't just lay out the story of everything fracturing. It also brings up a counterfigure, a voice from way back in the founding era, who it says was warning against this exact process.
The paper points to the anti-federalist writer known as Brutus, as the guardian of that original integrated view. Brutus was all about demanding precise legal language. He warned that if you use vague abstract principles, you're just giving judges the power to remake the law however they want. So as you see here, he represents what the paper calls covenantal realism. This idea that law has to reflect a fixed reality. And that's in direct opposition to Wilson's legal rationalism, where law is just something constructed by elites.
So, okay, we've got these three cuts in law, in knowledge, and in truth. What are the actual real-world consequences? And what, if anything, does the paper say we can do about it?
Well, the paper argues this whole metaphysical dissection thing isn't just some abstract, dusty philosophical problem. It claims the consequences are the very issues we're dealing with today. Legal terms like liberty and justice losing any stable meaning, a judiciary that's essentially writing new laws. And all of this leading to a kind of moral and civic confusion which then splinters out into cultural fragmentation.
So how do you fix it? Well, the source doesn't suggest some simple policy change. No, it argues the Republic has to undertake what it calls metaphysical reintegration, a really conscious effort to reunify its public understanding of truth, law, and reality, to glue those pieces back together.
And this last quote from the paper really hammers home its central message. The argument is that you can't just tinker with the procedures. That's not enough. For a republic to actually be just and to even make sense, it has to recover the very philosophical foundations that this source argues were there at the very beginning.
And that really leaves us with a final big thought. Whether you agree with this source's diagnosis or its proposed cure, that's one thing. But it definitely forces us to ask a pretty crucial question. How much do the abstract philosophical ideas of a society really matter? And what happens to all our civic structures when those foundational ideas start to crack?